Howdy folks, my name is Bucket Fridge. I hope you're all doing very well today. Thank you so much for stopping by the channel. In today's video, we're going to go over all the new warrior changes. They reworked the regular tree quite a bit, and they tweaked around some things in the spec trees. So we're going to go over the patch notes from the blue post, and after a little bit of housekeeping, we'll hop right into the talent trees. Alrighty, just a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get started. First thing is, if you are interested in all things tanking, this is definitely the channel for you. I'm going to be covering all the different tanks and doing a weekly segment where we go all over all the different tank changes after we get the Bear and Pally updated and get those videos out as well. So again, if you're interested in all things tanking, this is the channel for you. Warrior is a little unique, as I love Warrior is my favorite class, and I've played all three specs at a mythic rating level, so this is a little bit unique, but the rest of the videos will be primarily about tanking. And secondly, this is just my personal opinion. As always, I encourage all my viewers to watch as many content creators as you can and make the decisions that are best for you, because only you know what is best for you when playing World of Warcraft. So with that stuff out of the way, let's get into the patch notes and see what's poppin'. All right, let's get into this blue post and see what we got going on. Hello Warriors, this week we've been mostly fixing errors and tweaking things for the class, arms, and fury tree. We're happy with where these are at, and don't intend to make any large changes moving forward. Arms and fury and the various options within seem to be performing well, and people are enjoying them. We'll be monitoring the feedback and tuning things where needed. We focus more on protection this week and provided more details below. All right, so it seems like they're pretty happy where arms and fury are at least with the class tree design, so it doesn't seem like they're going to do any big overhauls, where primarily a lot of their focus seems to be around Prot going forward. And from what I've seen, spoiler alert, I've read these already, but from what it looks like they're just trying to rein Prot's damage in. They're not changing too much in the talent tree per se, but they're just kind of tweaking the numbers, as Prot was doing quite a bit of damage on beta. So let's go over the class tree, and then we'll go down each one of the specs, and then we'll look at the trees after we go over each of the specs. Alrighty, so class tree. Bitter immunity is once again more easily available, but no longer will clear bleeds. I think that's okay. I still think it's a fantastic cooldown, but even though the bleeds are not something that is wide or ubiquitous amongst a lot of bosses or even in rating or Mythic Plus content, it's a little bit of a nerf, but I don't think it's that bad to where you wouldn't take it anymore. So not too sad to see, and they put it in a better spot, it looks like. I believe they put it right here under the heroic leap, so that's always a good spot to put it, as you're going to be usually speccing down into this area anyways, so I don't mind it being here as opposed to being behind Blood and Thunder. Most, like his Fury, for example, you didn't want to have to take Blood and Thunder or Crackling Thunder to get bitter immunity, so placing it over here actually is much better because you don't mind taking Bounding Stride or Wrenching Impact on DPS or Prot. So good change in my opinion. Battle Stance now reduces the the effects of root and snares by 10%, was 15 already. Now reduce the effects of incapacitating effects was 10%, so a little 5% nerf on those. Not too big of a deal. Inspiring Presence tooltip updated to make its effect clearer. Okay. Spear of Bastion now grants 20 rage, was 25, so a smidge of a rage nerf. 5 rage isn't a huge amount, but it definitely is enough to add up over the course of a raid fight or a Mythic Plus. Elysian Might now extends the duration of Spear of Bastion by 2 seconds, was 4 seconds. That's really interesting. That seems kind of like a net nerf to me, a nerf by 100% essentially, or 50% from 4 seconds down to 2 seconds, but that's a pretty huge nerf. I'm curious to see how Spear of Bastion will perform now. It's still very good, obviously, for the both DPS specs, but for Prot, I don't know that it's necessarily going to compete with some of the other talents. You know, you guys, if you've watched my videos before, you know how I feel about the Shockwave talent. I think they're very good, but we'll get into that in the trees. Piercing Verdict, damage and rage now increased to 50%, was 30. They're trying to make Piercing Verdict a little bit more in line with Elysian Might, it looks like. For most DPS, you're picking Elysian Might. Piercing Verdict was usually better for Prot just because it gave you extra damage and extra rage right in the beginning of the pull with the spear, so that's not too bad at all. Those go up and make it even better for Prot, but I don't know that the DPS will pick Piercing Verdict. Endurance Training for Fury now increases stamina by 5% and reduces the effective movement pairing effects by on you by 10%. Not too bad. But Endurance Training for Arms and Protection now increases stamina by 5% and reduces the duration of Fear, Sap, and Incapacitate on you by 10%. I think these are largely more of PvP buffs or nerfs, but I mean, it does have some effect in rating or Mythic Plus, just not a ton, so it's not too bad. Thunderous Roar now deals damage in a 12-yard radius, was a frontal cone, and now also generates 10 rage. I think that's much better. Sometimes a cone can be finicky to aim and make sure that you're getting all the right mobs in it that you want to get it in. So now it's just a big old radius around you, very similar to how Dragon Warrior used to function if you've played with that back in the day. But it also generates 10 rage. And same thing with Shockwave. That's also really, really cool to see that they're also going to be a rage generator, because both those talents were, I think, worth taking, excuse me. But now that they generate even more rage, I think it just adds to their viability. Shockwave now generates 10 rage, excuse me. Avatar now grants 15 rage, was 20. Again, it's a 5 rage nerf, which isn't a huge amount, but like I said, with Spear of Bastion, that can add up over the course of a Mythic Plus or a boss fight. So, Crushing Force for protection, tooltip now correctly updated, granting 5% increased critical damage per rank. All right, and Barbaric Training reduces, the damage reduced to 30% from 40% on Revenge. That's not too bad. A 10% nerf is obviously a 10% nerf, but it was pretty free damage on Prot specifically, just because Revenge was something that you'll get lots of procs of. So it was just a flat 40% increase to damage on Revenge, so they just tuned it down a little bit. I don't think that's too bad at all. All right, let's get into arms. Alrighty, so let's go down the arms notes, and then we'll spec down the arms tree. So it says Arms Stormwall now has a lockout period of 1 second, so it means you can't just infinitely proc the storm walls during its duration. Makes it not very good. I don't know that you would really take it in PvE now. It could be useful in PvP, but I think it's a not a very good talent for PvE any longer, unfortunately. Dance of Death, clarified tooltip to make it clear you are not required to get the killing blow. That's actually really cool, because the Dance of Death it seemed like a hard ability to play around with your Blade Storm. It seemed like you were having to save your Blade Storm for the end of the pack as opposed to the very beginning of the pack, and only if you got the killing blow would it extend the duration, but they're now making it clear that you do not need to get the killing blow, which is actually really cool and maybe makes it a little bit more playable. I still don't know if it's better than the other talents that go along with the Blade Storm, or any of the abilities that also have that Dance of Death where you get an extra duration on the kills. So I don't know. We'll have to see if it's worth it or not. It's better, but I don't know if it's worth it still. Exploiter no longer affects cleave. The synergy did not work in practice. That doesn't seem too bad. Fracture updated, tooltip to not reference Thunderous Roar, so Fracture doesn't make the Thunderous Roar bleed fall off immediately. So I don't know if necessarily that's a nerf per se. Maybe they felt it was too powerful using the Thunderous Roar with Fracture, so that's probably what is going on there. Bloodborne no longer increases the initial damage of Rend, so that's not too bad either. Just essentially the Bloodborne increases the bleed damage of your Rend and your other bleeds, but not the initial damage, which makes sense. If it's meant to increase the amount of bleed damage that you're doing, it doesn't necessarily need to be increasing the initial damage, as the initial damage isn't bleed damage. So that makes sense. I'm not too upset about that. Exploit the weakness removed from the talent tree. Okay, not terrible. Deft Experience now grants 1% mastery and increases Tactician's chance to trigger by 0.5% per rank. So 2 points, I imagine, would be 1% of extra Tactician procs. Tactician obviously is very good for arms. Ren's initial damage has been increased to 64% damage was 32, and I think the reason they did that is because they then took the initial damage off of Bloodborne and increased the initial damage in the actual Rend ability itself. So I think that's just fine with me. And then Massacre updated Massacre visuals. We'll have to hop in beta and see what that looks like, but I'm always a fan of really cool animations. For example, with the Venthyr ability, one of my favorite parts of the Venthyr ability was its animation. I think people underestimate how much more interesting gameplay is when all your abilities have really cool animations. So now that we went over the arms notes, let's go down the arms tree and we'll see what we can get into there. Alrighty, let's go down the tree and see what we find in all the changes. All right, so I definitely think you still want defensive stance as arms, excuse me. I think that's still a very powerful defensive cooldown for us. What we'll do is we'll take our War Machine, we'll grab our Rallying Cry, is obviously that is kind of a non-negotiable for being in a raid setting. Then we will take our Spell Reflection so we can get our Heroic Leap and our Thunderclap, and we'll get some fast footwork so we can get our Frothing Berserker. Frothing Berserker is really, really good. Crushing Force is still kind of a schmeh talent for me. I don't know that I'm a super fan of it. It's not necessarily bad. Slam has always been kind of a filler, and I know that it generates rage now, so it's not terrible, but it's not my favorite. So we'll have to see what we can get into. I think for now what I'll do is I'll take Pain and Gain, and then we'll take Reinforced Plate so we get some extra armor, and then get down into our Hone Reflexes. We'll grab our Wrenching Impact for our extra grippy grips, and we'll take the Bitter Immunity. Even though it is no longer bleeds, it's still okay. Double Time is still fantastic. As we are going arms and we're using Rend, we'll take our Blood and Thunder. It's interesting that they put Titanic Throw here below, or excuse me, above Spear of Bastion. I feel like people probably weren't taking this hardly at all, so they feel like they wanted to put it in a spot where they could make it more widely taken, because most DPS will probably spec down into Spear of Bastion. I think arms for sure will probably spec into Spear of Bastion, unless you're going the bleed build, then you would spec into Thunderous Roar, but I think both might be very viable. It'll just depend on how the tuning works. But for now, obviously, if we're going to take Spear of Bastion, we have to take our Titanic Throw, and we got our Seismic Reverberations are very, very good. And so now we have 3 points to get down to the bottom. So I think what's probably better than taking Crushing Force is I would probably do something like this, where I take the increased leech, the increased auto attack speed, and then some barbaric training. Slam and Whirlwind deal 40% more damage, but costs 5 more rage. That is okay. 40% damage for 5 more rage is really pretty good, but I don't know that we need the extra rage as arms. It's kind of a cushion to have, and it was kind of something you could take where if you need to fill out the points, but it's not necessary. It's nice, but it's not necessary. And same thing, there's lots of utility with either a Stormbolt and or Intimidating Shout. So there's lots of different utility that you can pick from if you needed to. But I think for now, I prefer this. But you could do something like this instead. If you didn't want to take these two or these 3, you could always spec into the Crushing Force and then take Stormbolt for some extra utility, or Leech for some extra survivability. It really depends. But I'm really not a huge fan of Crushing Force, so I think instead we'll do what we had there, go down into Barbaric Training. So I still think that we want Avatar. I think every spec of Warrior wants Avatar. It's just such an incredible cooldown. But the Memory of the Tormented Blade Master seems very, very good, but the interesting one is activating Avatar or Colossal Smash casts Recklessness at reduced effectiveness. I think this one is going to be better, because Recklessness obviously is not something that ARMS usually has access to. Recklessness is obviously a very powerful cooldown, and so I think because it activates for both Avatar and Colossal Smash, I think that'll actually net you a decent amount of uptime on Recklessness when you're popping your cooldown, so I actually really like that as opposed to the Tormented Blade Master. I think this will probably net more damage, but we will do some testing and figure out which one is better. And again, so let's say we're going to do the bleed build. I think we'd spec into the Thunderous Roar, and if we're going to just go more of a straight typical arms warrior overpower kind of build and not focus as much on the bleeds, I think this Spear of Bastion would be very good. I think either are fine. So it's kind of tough. So I've really been liking the way that the bleed build has been looking and all the buffs that have been going into the bleed build. So I am quite the fan of the bleed build, but Spear of Bastion is still very good for both the DPS specs. So why don't we try out the bleed build again? And they reworked the quick thinking and cruel strikes. I think these are actually a pretty cool point nodes now. So, but for now, I think what we'll do is we'll take both of these bad boys. I think they're both very, very good. And we'll spend one of our last points here. And then we have some options. We can either get increased critical strike chance by 1%, or we can get some extra endurance. I think the 5% extra stamina acts a little bit like a extra defensive. So I think it's pretty good. So we have quite a few defensives, right? We have our Pain and Gain, we have some extra leech, we have our defensive stance, we have a rallying cry, we have 5% extra stamina, we have our bitter immunity. So we're actually going to be quite tanky as arms, which is actually quite a nice change from how arms usually plays. Arms is usually the squishiest of the 2 DPS specs for Warrior, and so being able to have access to a bunch of different nice little defensives like that, I think is actually quite powerful for arms, and it will definitely increase the survivability. And you could take, for example, if you didn't want to take the leech and go down this side, you could also take Impending Victory or Intervene if that was something that you really need. And again, you can take Crushing Force, but I'm not sold on it yet. I'll have to do some more testing with it, but I'm not a huge fan of this yet. I think the other options in the tree are probably a bit better. But again, if you didn't want to do the bleed build, you could take the points out of here and go down in the Spear of Bastion. And the one thing that's pretty interesting too, if you took the point out of the quick thinking, and if say you were doing an M+, you could actually take a Shockwave in an M+, if that was something that you guys needed for CC, but it's not always necessary. It's just something to note, which I think is pretty cool, that you can take 2 of the capstones and then also grab Shockwave if need be. I don't know that the warriors will always need, or excuse me, the DPS warriors will always need to grab Shockwave. It can be helpful, but I don't know that it's necessary, but it is pretty cool, specifically for M+. It's not always very applicable in a raid setting, unless there are lots of ads to control, then it could be useful. But I think for now, what we'll do instead is we'll go down into the bleed build, and we'll rock that way. I think really, both of these are really cool. I love the thunderous words, the damage of all your bleeds by 20% at all times. That is such a powerful effect. I really, really like this side. So that's the general tree. Now let's see what trouble we can get into with the arms tree specifically. All right, let's go down the arms tree and see what we got. So obviously these are kind of our non-negotiables. Up here, we'll take our Die by the Sword, very powerful cooldown. And since they put an internal cooldown of 1 second on this, I don't think it was very good to start with. It was okay, but now that it has a 1 second internal cooldown, that kind of defeats the purpose, as this only lasts 8 seconds. So I'm not sure if I'm a crazy huge fan of it now, but since we are going the bleed build, I think the Fueled by Violence will definitely be a better option for us. And it's cool they put Blood Surge up here. And since we are doing the bleed build, we will definitely take our Blood Surge, and then why don't we take our improved Overpower, and then we'll take our Tactician, we'll take our Rend and our Skull Splitter, we'll take some Bloodborne and some Dreadnought. Then obviously we need to take our Colossal Smash, we are taking the Colossal Smash that casts Recklessness, so we definitely want to be taking that. Obviously Anger Management is very good. I love Test of Might, and even though they did nerf it, it was 5% strength for every 30 rage that you spent. So now if you spend 30 rage, you only get 30 or 3% strength. So it's a 2% nerf, which is pretty substantial when you think about it. It's roughly a little less than a 50% nerf, but Test of Might was very, very, very strong. And so I imagine that they'll probably keep tweaking the numbers on this until they find a nice happy medium. But I'm going to operate under the assumption that they're going to balance it correctly. I think they just worry about this being too powerful if they choose to leave it very well statted, so to speak. And then if we were doing AoE, we could definitely take Blunt Instruments or a Warbreaker. Either one of those are very good talents. But I think for now what we'll do instead is we'll spec down into the Fervor of Battle. We'll take our Impale, and then we will take our Massacre so we can do some more executing. I think we want to spec down into this side of the tree. I think the Bloodletting is probably a bit better than the Battle Lord. I don't think Battle Lord is bad by any means, but I think that Bloodletting is probably better for the bleed build. We'll take our Fatality, as that is the creme de la creme for our bleed build, leaving us with 6 points left. So I think what we'll do is we'll take our Mortal Strike, we'll get down into Critical Thinking, and then we have a choice between our Sharpened Blades and our Exploiter. So I don't know if they, because it says in the tree that they removed Exploiter. Exploit the Weakness was removed from the tree, not Exploiter, excuse me. So either one of these are very, very good. So what we can do is we can take Exploiter. I think the stacking Execute with our Juggernaut, allowing our Mortal Strike, which is one of our primary sources of damage as well, to do more damage. This has always been very good, and Juggernaut is just too darn good not to take, in my opinion. So leaving us with 1 point. And so if this is a single target scenario, we obviously don't need our Sweeping Strikes or our Cleave. So we could take something like Blunt Instruments instead, kind of rounding out the talent points. But if we were doing more of an AoE scenario, you could take Warbreaker in its place. And then also, if you didn't need Warbreaker, you could take your Sweeping Strikes. So there's quite a few different options that we have here. But I think the bleed build will be both good in AoE and single target, where I feel like the Bladestorm build is obviously very much geared towards AoE, but the bleed build has the option to flex into both, where Bladestorm on single target has never been the greatest. And I think taking Juggernaut is just too good as arms to not take. I really don't. I feel like you're going to spec into this, whether you're going into the Bladestorm part of it or the bleed part of it. I think this part of the tree is just too good not to take. Juggernaut is an absolutely bananas cooldown, or excuse me, ability, not cooldown. But I think, like I said, this is too good not to take. And so in a single target scenario, we'll just take our Blunt Instruments. So for bleed build, I would do something like this. If you wanted to, again, you could go down into the Bladestorm route, but I don't know that that's always necessary. So but again, if you want to do Bladestorm, you could do something like this instead and take some Elysian Might, and then instead of specking into all the different bleed abilities up here, we could get down into the middle part for our Bladestorm. And we have the Dance of Death. Again, it's better than it was, but I don't know if it's going to be better than, say, the abilities that we have here. Unhinged is a legendary that we have now, which is very, very good. And Hurricane is also very good. Hurricane was actually a PvP talent, as if you'll know. that you gained the stacking strength up to 6 times, giving you a 30% strength increase. That is a substantial amount of strength, so don't sleep on how much strength that actually gives you if you're going to go with the Bladestorm build. And Merciless Bone Grinder is obviously very good for multi-target. Let's spec into these first and see how many points we have left. So we have 2 points to operate with, so we could do something like, for example, we could do this and take our Cleave, and then take our Merciless Bone Grinder for more of an AoE situation. You could even spec out a Skull Splitter here and grab a different AoE talent. We could make our improved Cleave, or we could take either the Storm of Swords and or Collateral Damage for some extra AoE damage, but it really depends on what the situation calls for. So now that we've gone over arms, let's hop into Fury and see what's happening over there. All right, let's see what they said. Annihilator now generates 2 rage per attack. Again, I don't know if the single-minded Fury is really good. It's not necessarily bad, but I don't know that you're really speccing into Annihilator anyways. It's a nice little buff, but I don't know that Annihilator was really that popular to begin with. Dancing Blades now all procs correctly, as they mentioned up there. It's not you don't have to get the killing blow, you just have to have used it. The Blade Storm or of the AoE abilities that would trigger that in Ravager, Blade Storm, etc. Annihilator can now be used with 2-handed weapons, which is cool, but again, I don't know that Titan's Grip is going to spec down into Annihilator, but only time will tell, but my inclination is that it won't be. Damage was reduced to 206%, was 227%, so Rampage is probably doing a little bit too much damage with all the different buffs to the Rampage inside the tree, which makes a bit of sense. Hack and Slash was incorrectly triggering on Rampage, on every strike of Rampage instead of casting Rampage. We like this functionality, so now Hack and Slash has a 20% chance with each Rampage strike to refund a charge of Raging Blow. That's actually pretty cool. So for example, if you were out of Raging Charge, or Raging Blow charges, excuse me, then you could use a Rampage and they have a 20% chance. So of the essentially every 1 out of 5 will trigger a free charge of Raging Blow. Not too bad, pretty cool. Storm of Steel now causes Ravager to generate 15 rage per hit, was 10, so giving us a little bit more rage generation. That's always a good thing. Critical Thinking now grants 1% critical strike chance, was 1.5, and now correctly state that it affects Annihilator. I don't know that the 0.5 is really that big of a nerf. 1 to 1.5 is really not that much of a difference in the probability wise. It really doesn't change that much. And again, I don't know if Annihilator is really worth it for Fury. So Annihilator, Slam, and Thundersword, Shockwave, and Odin's Fury now gain extra rage benefit from Recklessness, which is very cool. Recklessness obviously is a very, very powerful cooldown for us. So those are all very good to get extra rage from during our Recklessness, to be able to cast more of our abilities when we are outside of Recklessness. So that's a very nice little change. Again, with Annihilator, I don't know that it's worth it, but the other ones, Slams, Thundersword, Shockwave, and Odin's Fury, are all very good, obviously. Then we have Massacre, the new updated visuals. Again, we'll have to go into beta and check on that and see what that is, what the new updated visual is. It'll be pretty interesting to see. Wrath and Fury now increases Raging Blow's damage by 10%, was 5, so a nice little 5% buff to Raging Blow. That's always good. The 5%, like I was mentioning, probably wasn't worth taking over the other ones, but bringing it back up to 10% probably makes it a little bit more worth speccing into now. Then we have Slaughtering Strikes. Auras now display correctly for both Raging Blow and Annihilator. It can now be triggered via Crushing Blow. Okay, it's not too terrible. It's just a little bit of bug fixing, it looks like. And now Blood Craze can be triggered via Bloodbath. So that's pretty cool. We'll have to see what it looks like in the tree. So why don't we hop into the Warrior Fury tree? Okay, let's go down the trees for Fury. Again, one of the things that I'm kind of bummed about is that you have to take Defensive Stance to get Rallying Cry. And I don't know that if you're ever playing Warrior in a Mythic Plus or rating environment that you don't want to take Rallying Cry. You can make an argument maybe for M Plus it's not necessary, but for a rating environment it's absolutely necessary. So we have to spec into Defensive Stance. It's not bad by any means, but it's definitely not something that Fury has usually had to use. It's always been more popular with Arms, as Arms has just been less defensive than Fury is. But since we do need a Rallying Cry, we do have to spec into it. And again, it's kind of a bummer that we don't have the battle stance here. Now we have to take the Berserker stance, which I'm still not a huge fan of, but that's okay. So we'll take our War Machine, as War Machine obviously is very, very good. We'll take some quick movement, and we'll take our Frothing Berserker. We'll take our Spell Reflection, our Heroic Leap. We'll take some Siphoning Strikes, and then we get down to this part of the tree. Again, I don't know that Crushing Force is my favorite, but it's definitely not bad. Obviously, we're not going to be specking down into this side of the tree, so we'll spec down into extra auto attack speed. Auto attack speed with two-handers is obviously very, very good. We'll take some Barbaric Training. So with Barbaric Training, they now have a 20% increased damage, and their critical strike chance is increased by 10% as well, or critical strike damage is increased by 10%. So not too shabby at all. And then we'll take sidearm so we can get down to seismic reverberations. We'll take some pain and gain so we can get some armor, and then we get some honed reflexes. We'll take our grip and we'll take some double time, leaving us with 2 points to play around with. So you could take, for example, you could take the extra rage here. You could take the improved inspiring presence if you so needed. If you needed more defensives, you could take impending victory. But I think with all the different defensive capabilities that we have in the tree so far, I don't know that you need to take more of them, especially since we have defensive stance now. So for the sake of things, we can do Crushing Force, as I think Crushing Force probably is a little bit better than Overwhelming Rage. But again, Slam deals an additional 60% damage and has an 15% increased critical strike chance. It could be all right. Again, Slam is always been a filler, and so it's kind of interesting to work it into the rotation now as it generates rage. So why don't we do that instead of the extra rage? As again, I think the extra rage isn't necessary, so a little bit of more damage is probably better there. So why don't we go down into Avatar, and then as you'll know from my other videos, I really love the Odin's Fury, Cold Steel, Hot Blood side of the tree over here. Both are very, very powerful. But if you didn't want to use that side of the tree, the Recklessness one is probably going to be just fine. It's a very powerful ability. Recklessness obviously is incredible. So, but for the purposes of this, I really like that side of the tree. This side of the tree more specifically, and you'll know as I've explained it numerous times why I love this side of the tree. So we'll spec down into of the Tormented Titan. We'll get our dual wielding damage, and now we have some options. So for example, since I really do like the bleeds from Cold Steel, Hot Blood, and Odin's Fury, I think Thunderous Roar is a perfectly acceptable route to go for Fury. But if you didn't like that side of the tree, you could just go down Old Reliable and get the Spear of Bastion with some Elysian Might, and then we could take some points in endurance training. And again, you could take Shockwave if you needed it for an M+ scenario, but if you didn't need it for M+, you could always just grab some extra haste. Haste is always good, especially that we get extra auto attack speed haste, and now we get additional, so we'd have 15% increased auto attack speed from a proc, which is very, very nice. But again, if you need to, you could grab Shockwave. But as I will be going to Thunderous Roar and Cold Steel, Hot Blood, I will be going down into Thunderous Roar down over here. But I do think taking the 1 point in endurance training is very good. 5% extra stamina is quite a bit of health. So now that we went down the regular tree and saw the changes there, why don't we hop into the Fury tree itself? Okay, Fury tree time. Let's obviously take our non-negotiables up here. I think all of these are very good. We'll take obviously our Enraged Regeneration. That was hard to say for some reason. We'll take our War Paint, we'll take our Improved Bloodthirst, and we'll take our Improved Raging Blow. We'll take our Rampage, as obviously that is one of our main DPS. We'll take all 3 of these bad boys, as they're all very, very good, and then we'll take our Recklessness. And then we'll spec down into Focus and Chaos, our Cold Steel, Hot Blood, our Blood Craze, and our our Bloodborne, and then our Blood Craze. Again, I've explained how wonderful Cold Steel, Hot Blood is more times than I can count now. So if you'll know, this is obviously an ability that we get from BFA from an Azerite trait. This was very, very powerful. So I really love this ability. I've explained it numerous times, so I won't bore you all again with it. And then on this side, we'll take our Cruelty, we'll take our Ashen Juggernaut, and then we'll take some Massacre action. Again, I think Juggernaut in Fury is also really, really cool to see. I really love the different ability to be that niche execute spec even inside Fury, which is really, really cool. We'll take our Deft Experience, we'll take our Odin's Fury, and then we still don't know what the placeholder talent is going to be, but for now, why don't we take the Dancing Blades and get some extra auto attack speed? So we'll have quite a bit, actually. We'll have the 20% auto attack speed increase from a critical strike. We'll have the 5% increased auto attack speed here. We'll not have the auto attack penalty, or your auto attacks can no longer miss. That's always very good, as dual wielding will give you a lower % chance to hit, as it's always been in WoW. So those are all very, very good. Again, I don't know that you necessarily need Storm of Swords or Annihilator. So I think for the last couple points, we'll spec into the Swift Strikes, and then we'll grab our Anger Management, which is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And I think Depths of Insanity is probably a little bit better than Unbridled Ferocity, but both are very good. I don't think you could go wrong in either one of these. So why don't we take our Depths of Insanity, we'll get our Onslaught, and then we'll take our Pulverize. And I really like that you can grab 3 different capstones inside the Fury tree. I really think that's pretty powerful to be able to grab all of them. And again, if you didn't want to go down this side of the tree, as we've explained, you could go down into this Ravager side of the tree. Ravager generates more rage now, which is very good. And I think the Hurricane is still a very good talent, even in multi-target or single target. Stacking strength is obviously very much a damage increase in AoE and single target. So the thing that I like about the bleed build is that it's, again, functional inside of an AoE build as well as a single target build. I think it's very powerful that way. But if you didn't want to go down this side, again, I don't know why you wouldn't, but I really enjoy that side of the tree. If you wanted to go more, say, a AoE focused spec, you could get improved whirlwind, and we can grab some meat cleaver. We'll get the same things here in the middle. We'll grab our anger management, reckless abandon. We'll take our critical thinking, we'll take the Ravager, and I think Hurricane is probably better than Storm of Steel with the extra rage regeneration. But the damage is also increased by 40%, but it had, or decreased by 40%, but it has 2 charges. Again, I'm not a super fan of this one, but I think Hurricane, the stacking strength buff is better, leaving us our 2 points to grab the last little point in Pulverize and Onslaught. So, but if you're going to do this build, then you would probably do something like this in its place instead. But you know me and my Cold Steel Hot Blood love, so we'll do something like that, and then we'll take the points out of these bad boys and go down into the ones that I really do think will be quite competitive. It might not be initially very competitive just because this has to, your Bloodthirst has to crit, and you get a stacking buff for your Bloodthirst crit here. But I really do think that as the expansion goes on and you're critting all the time, people will come to see how incredibly powerful this ability is. As I've mentioned a million times, I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk about it. So for now, why don't we spec down the tree like that? And it's not a lot changed in the class trees, just a few different tweaks and tuning to those. The majority of the changes come from inside of the actual warrior tree itself, but I think all the tanks are in a pretty, or excuse me, all the DPS warrior specs are in a pretty good spot, regardless of what you choose to do. The cool thing about the 2 DPS specs for warrior is that they really do give you some options. You can go the Spear of Bastion, very heavy on the crit and more focused on AoEs and Bladestorm and etc., or you can go more of the bleed build for both arms and for Fury, which is really cool, and for Prot as well for that matter. That's, I think, everything for Fury. So let's go over the protection notes, and then we'll go down the protection trees as well. All right, lots to get through for Prot, so let's hop into it. Protection developer notes. We started putting more focus on protection this week. You see larger updates, and next week also stay tuned for that video, as we'll be updating that, obviously. We're happy with protection warriors are playing, but they have been overperforming in both terms of survivability and damage, so we've made a few tweaks. I think that's okay. They were doing insane amounts of damage. I don't want to be broken, I just want to be competitive. We don't intend to make large structural changes to Prot, which is very good. Our goals are to mainly work around bug fixing. That's always very good. And we've made some changes to the baseline Vanguard ability to account for the large amount of survivability bonuses inside the talent tree, which I don't think is bad either. Vanguard is just a passive that you get for being protection. So we'll discuss that as we go down the different notes. Deep Wounds should now trigger a Blood Surge correctly. Wonderful. It wasn't triggering correctly, but we were operating under the assumption that it does. So that's not necessarily new information. Titanic Throw fixed an issue that causes Titanic Throw to get 100% bonus from improved Heroic Throw twice. That's interesting, but obviously it was a bug. Heroic/Titanic Throw now has a 3-second cooldown, which is kind of a bummer. You used to be able to just throw your little Heroic Throw a bunch, pulling mobs at a ranged. The auto attack damage reduced by 20. That's okay, as we're getting a bunch of auto attack damage and speed increases. So it's probably doing too much damage, obviously. Brace for Impact, the R tooltip has now should now correctly reference a Shield Slam. Now increases Shield Slam damage by 5% per stack, was 10%, but lasts for 15 seconds, was 9 seconds. So it's quite a bit longer buff, which is very nice, but it's 5% per stack, so obviously this won't stack as high. So we'll have to see if that's better than what is next to it with the Unnerving Focus. Spike Shield now causes high threat. I still don't know if that's worth it necessarily. You're not really having issues with threat as Prot right now because you're doing an incredible amount of damage. Even with the nerfs, I still think you'll be doing very competitive damage, if not the most of all the tanks. So I don't know that this makes it any more viable per se. New talent, Dance of Death. If your Ravager helps kill an enemy, it lasts 2 seconds longer and has 20% increased damage. Again, this is a little bit harder to plan, but it could be worth taking. We'll have to see. Champion's Bulwark should now add to the existing shield block durations. That's always good to see. More shield block uptime is always good. We got our Juggernaut has a maximum of 10 stacks for protection, but lasts 20 seconds. So again, if that's something that we need to be doing, we don't always need Juggernaut in the beginning of expansions, especially, excuse me, just because obviously we don't necessarily want to be spending our rage on executes. But towards later in the expansion, that could be very, very useful. And then we got the visual updates to Massacre. Now, Enduring Alacrity now grants 1% per rank was 2. That makes sense. So we get a 2% haste increase from 4. 4% was quite a lot with the other haste increases that we had in the tree as well. Focus Vigor now grants 1% crit was 2%. That seems understandable. And Vanguard increases from your stamina increased by 30% was 45. So 15% decrease, which is nothing. It's not a small amount, but it's not a huge amount either. So it's a little bit of a nerf, but there really is quite a bit of survivability in the tree. So I'm pretty okay with this. Increase your strength by 70% of your armor value was 100%. Again, there's more armor value inside of the tree, and so I think that's why they wanted to reduce that a bit, as it was scaling too much, which makes sense. Revenge damage reduced from 53, it was 63. A little 10% nerf isn't too bad, but again, because this does increase your revenge damage, that's probably why they tuned it down just a little bit. Shield Slam damage reduced from 80 to 80 was 85. I really think that's quite a negligible nerf. You really won't notice a difference. 5% is obviously 5%, but it's not a huge amount. Punish Shield Slam now deals 10% increased damage, was 20%. Again, they're just kind of tuning the numbers down just a smidge. A 10% nerf is a decent amount, but it's still going to be a talent worth taking. Master of Cold, revenge damage is now 10%, was 20%, and 30% when free it was 50%. Even though Cold Steel Hop, or excuse me, Bester of Cold isn't bad, it's in a spot where I don't necessarily know that it will compete with the other talent choices. Unnerving Focus now grants 50% rage generation, was 60. I still think that is still very, very good. 50 from 60 isn't too much. Show of Force, Thunderclap damage is now 20%, was 25. Again, they're just tuning the numbers a smidge. Booming Voice now generates 30 rage, was 40, so that's quite a bit of a nerf. 10 rage every time with Booming Voice, but again, we have quite a bit of rage generation, so I don't think that these will largely affect it too much. Rend, the initial damage was reduced to 32, was 64, and the periodic damage reduced to 17, was 23. So Rend was just doing way too much damage for Prot. That's okay. Execute damage reduced by 8%. We didn't. Again, with the execute, we don't always need to be executing, and I don't know that we take Juggernaut, at least initially, so that's not too bad. 8% when you're already critting for 200%, that's not too big of a deal. And then Shield Charge no longer has a minimum rage. Now that's the really interesting one, because as we've talked about that a little earlier, the issue with the Shield Charge was that it had an 8 yards minimum range, and that it kind of functioned as a ability very similar to the Reprisal that we have now. So now that it no longer has a minimum range, it's actually really quite interesting, because you can use it in combat and get all the extra rage generation and all the wonderful things that come with the Reprisal. Even though Reprisal was a bit of a band-aid, the Shield Charge no longer having a minimum range is actually really interesting. So we'll hop into that. So let's go down the 2 trees and see what we can do and see if there's actually a different build path this time. Alrighty, quite a few changes, so let's get into them. This is pretty exciting, actually. The cool thing that I notice now is they give us both defensive stance and battle stance for free in the beginning of the tree. That is really, really awesome. I like that quite a bit. So you don't have to waste the point to spec into this over here. I really, really do enjoy that. That is quite good. All right. So we'll take our War Machine. We'll take our Rallying Cry, obviously Spell Reflect. We'll take some Heroic Leap, some Thunderclapping, some extra movement speed, and Frothing Berserker. This is a very, very powerful ability. And then we'll take some extra Leech and some extra auto attack speed. We definitely want to take our Crushing Force in this, as it affects our Shield Slam damage, which is very, very nice. We'll take our increased armor and our Hone Reflexes. We'll take our Wrenching Impact for the sake of this. We'll take our Bitter Immunity again, which is very good. Obviously, double time is incredible. Our Blood and Thunder. We'll take our Titanic Throw and our Seismic Reverberations, leaving us 1 point, what I probably think is either best spent in Barbaric training, or you could take the Inspiring Presence. Both are very good, or if you really didn't want to take the Inspiring Presence, you could always take the Impending Victory if you needed extra defensives. Again, Pain and Gain for a little bit of extra defensives. If you needed Intervene for the other tank for a certain boss mechanic, you could tank that. This last point is a little bit of filler. If you needed an extra stun in M+, you could always take Stormbolt, or another intimidating shout for some extra CC. There is quite a bit of options, but now that we are in the bottom part of the tree, definitely want to take Armored to the Teeth, obviously very powerful, and then we definitely want to take our Unstoppable Force with the other one, the new one, Immovable Object, activating Avatar Cast or Shield Wall, cast the other at reduced effectiveness. Now this is actually really interesting. Obviously improved Immovable Object is going to be more of a defensive cooldown. Your avatar pops a shield wall, which is obviously very, very powerful, but we do have our shield slam reducing the cooldown of our wall, which will be interesting to see. That actually might be a decent amount of survivability added if you really needed the extra survivability, but I definitely do think we still want to take Unstoppable Force. It's just too good. Avatar increased the damage of Thunderclap and Shockwave by 50%. They added that on top of it, so now, holy cow, that's so much. Oh my gosh, that is incredible. 50% extra damage on the Shockwave and Thunderclap, cooldown reduced by 50%. My goodness, that is so very good. So we will break down the math on why that is now insane. This is dealing, your Shockwave will deal 600% damage. I'll repeat that. Your Shockwave is going to deal 600% damage. And you're like, how is 600% when it says 350? So let's spec into it and we'll see why. So Sonic Boom says Shockwave deals 350% increased damage and will always deal a critical strike. So we have the 350% damage, and then if you add the 200% extra damage on top of it from the critical strike chance, or from the crit, always critting, excuse me, that puts you up to 550. And then our Unstoppable Force also makes Shockwave do an additional 50% damage. So that is 600% damage on Shockwave on a 25-second cooldown, because we're going to be taking Rumbling Earth. Granted, this is very powerful in a Mythic Plus scenario and won't always be applicable in a raiding environment if it's a single target environment, but in M+, this is absolutely bonkers. I don't know why people are sleeping on Shockwave. Dealing 600% extra damage is so much damage, and it's up every 25 seconds. In the other video, I broke down the math, but now the math has actually changed a bit. So why don't we break down the math after we finish this tree? So for the last couple points, we obviously want to get our one-handed weapon specialization. And so now we have a few different points to spec into. I think what we'll do instead is we'll spec down into our quick thinking and get the extra haste. Haste is very good, a very good stat for us. I don't know that we need the extra damage or the extra crit. Crit's never been something that Warrior has been overly fond of in Prot. So I think the extra haste is a bit better. But again, if you didn't want to go into Shockwave, say it wasn't a Mythic Plus scenario, say it was just a normal raiding environment, either one of these, I think Spear of Bastion or Thunderous Roar are very good. But I think we'll go down into Thunderous Roar, and I think we'll take the extra bleed damage and Uproar. But you could also, if you really wanted to, take the 2 points in crit there if you didn't want to buff Thunderous Roar, which is always a possibility. And you could even take out of Endurance Training and do something like this if you really wanted to. You could take 2 of the not quite capstone level talents, but 2 of the very powerful talents in Thunderous Roar and Spear of Bastion. Both are very good, but I don't know that you necessarily want to take both of these without speccing into some of the very powerful things on the bottom. So in single target, it's hard to say which one will probably do more damage. I would be inclined to think that Spear of Bastion does more damage initially than Thunderous Roar. But when you count the extra damage that Thunderous Roar adds to your bleeds with both Deep Wounds and Rend on Prot, the damage might be fairly close. So we'll have to do some testing and figure it out, but I'm more inclined to think that I would rather be down into Thunderous Roar and making our bleeds better. And I definitely think we still want the stamina. But again, Shockwave and Sonic Boom in Mythic Plus is crazy good. So let's break down the math on why it's so crazy good. Alrighty, so we're here on the beta just to get the numbers so we can do some of the math for the Shockwave versus Spear of Bastion for Prot. So let's look at Shockwave. It says it deals 1,249 damage, call it 1,250 damage, and stunning all enemies for 10 yards for 2 seconds. And then we have Spear of Bastion dealing 10,306 damage, and then an additional 9,914 damage, over 4 seconds. And then I think as Prot, you would probably take the Spear of piercing verdict as opposed to the Elysian Might, so it deals an extra 50% damage. So let's get our handy dandy notepad out. Alrighty, so let's do some math. So we need to calculate the Spear of Bastion damage initially. So the initial damage is 10,306, and we need a 50% more of 10,306, 50%, an additional 5,153 damage. So we'll put that in parentheses here if we were to take that talent, which I think you would for Prot. I don't know that Elysian Might is necessary for Prot. Extra damage. And so we'll add all those up, giving us a total of 25,373 damage overall if all the enemies lived the entire duration of the Spear of Bastion. And so we end up with a total of 25,373 damage every 90 seconds. All right, so now let's do the math on Shockwave. So we got our Shockwave doing 1,250 damage. So we have our 1,250 times 6, giving us a 7,500 damage. So we have times 6 for the 600% damage increase. So that equals an additional 7,500 damage every 25 seconds. So, as we know that Shockwave is a much lower cooldown than the Spear of Bastion, obviously we don't quite get 4. So if we take the 7,500 damage and we times that by 3, as we will be doing that we will essentially get 3 Shockwaves for every 1 Spear of Bastion. So we have 7,500. So that equals 22,500 damage every 90 seconds, or about every 75 seconds. So as you can see, the damage for these is fairly close. It's only about 3,000 damage, and this only continues to add. So for example, the longer this goes, the better Shockwave gets, as you'll just have more Shockwaves than Spear of Bastions, if that makes sense. And because one of the big things that we've always talked about as well, if you guys remember, is that it will also not be target capped. So Spear of Bastion does reduced damage over 5 targets. We don't know how much reduced damage over 5 targets, which is a little bit of a bummer, but Shockwave, no target cap, which in M plus actually is pretty substantial, because in M plus we're going to be pulling fairly large and trying to get as many packs as we can. So as you can see, the big difference starts to be the bigger you pull, the more that Shockwave seems to stand out. I think people are talking really negatively about Shockwave in recent days, just because obviously it's not very powerful for the DPS specs, which I would agree with. But for Prot, the extra stun that you get at the beginning of the pulls is huge, and it's always up. It's up every 25 seconds. So as you can see, they're quite comparable in damage. And again, the more that you're pulling, the better that Shockwave gets. And that is really powerful. And again, the longer the dungeon goes on, the better that Shockwave gets, because we have the Spear of Bastion every 90 seconds versus the Shockwave every 25 seconds. So you'll just end up netting more Shockwaves than you will Spear of Bastions. And especially because the extra CC from the Spear of Bastion is nice, but it's more niche than the stun is. The stun is always applicable in M+, and I think it is an incredibly powerful ability. So let's do a little bit of extra math just to kind of illustrate the point. All right, just to kind of further illustrate this point, so let's pick a time frame which would give them the exact lineup that they would have their cooldowns coming up at the exact same time. So for example, let's use, say, 450 seconds, which would get us 5 Spears of Bastion. So if we have the 450 seconds, which is roughly 7.5 minutes. So 7.5 minutes. So we have our Spear of Bastion doing 25,373 damage. 25,000. The 5 gives us a total of 126,865 damage in those 5 Spears of Bastions. Then if we do the same thing with Shockwave, so we have the 450 seconds, so we have 450 seconds divided by the 25-second cooldown that we have for Shockwave, that nets us 18 Shockwaves. So if we take our 7,500 damage, and we times that by 18, that gets us a total of 135,000 damage. And as you can very well tell, which number is bigger. So as I was illustrating, the more time that you have in the dungeon, especially for higher keys where you'll have 30 something minutes, you're going to have Shockwave up a lot more than you will Spear of Bastion. So if we're talking about the exact same amount of time to where both of these cooldowns line up, that they would come up at the exact same time if you use them on cooldown with your pulls, Spear of Bastion nets you 9,000 less damage than Shockwave does. And so as you can see, even if we're talking about one total cooldown, the Spear of Bastion obviously will net you about 3,000 more damage, a little less, like 2,700 extra damage, whereas if the longer the dungeon goes on, the more chances for Shockwave that you have. And as you can illustrate, in the same amount of time, in that 7.5 minutes, Shockwave will be performing about 9,000 more damage, and this only continues to grow as the dungeon goes on longer. So I hope this will put to bed the notion that the Shockwave talent, and that Shockwave is bad, and that it's a bad talent, that it shouldn't be down there, and not even Prot wants it. I don't know where this is coming from, because if you listen to people like Now and Scott, they will tell you and bestow the virtues of how good Shockwave is, and I don't know why people are sleeping on it. So again, I hope this math can illustrate for you how powerful Shockwave is. All right, now that we got all that math out of the way, I hope I didn't melt your brain. I apologize for all that math, but I just wanted to illustrate a point that Shockwave just continues to be very, very good in M+ and gets slept on. And again, this isn't necessarily something that you would take as DPS, but if we're talking strictly about Prot in this scenario, I think Shockwave and this bundle of talents will net you more than the Spear of Bastion will over the course of an M+. And like I said, I hope the math helps illustrate that for you guys. So now let's go down the actual protection tree itself, because there's quite a bit of changes, which is actually pretty exciting. So we have our Ignore Pain, we have our Revenge, we have our Demoralizing Shout, our Devastator, and our Last Stand, kind of all non-negotiables. The really interesting thing up here is they've actually put Booming Voice down here as more of a capstone node for how powerful Booming Voice is. So we know that it is an incredibly powerful ability, and it's down here, and that's okay, because being up here, it was just kind of a no-brainer auto take. The interesting thing, though, is now that we have the difference choice node right here, I actually think that Best Served Cold will be better than Improved Heroic Throw. And I think the reason that they tuned down Best Served Cold is because now it's probably going to be taken. I don't know that Improved Heroic Throw is going to be very good, especially because as it's an Improved Heroic Throw, it's going to have a 3-second cooldown on it. So I don't know if that's terribly good. So we have our Strategist, obviously very powerful. We want to be resetting our Shield Slam. And so we have a little bit of a choice here now with Unnerving Focus and Brace for Impact. Both are very, very good. Using Shield Slam increases your Shield Slam damage by 5%. And it increases the amount that you can block by 5%, stacking up to 5 times. So our Shield Slam will be doing a maximum of 25% extra damage, and will be blocking 25% more damage, which is very, very powerful. And Last Stand increases your rage generation by 50%. Both of these are incredibly, incredibly powerful, but I think Brace for Impact will probably net you a little bit more damage and a little bit more survivability than having the little bit of extra rage. Maybe not a little bit of extra rage, but both are very good. I don't think that you could go wrong picking either of these talents. I think Brace for Impact just edges out Unnerving Focus just slightly. We obviously have to take our Challenging Shout to get down to our Thunderlord, and our Thunderlord is obviously an incredibly powerful cooldown for us. And then we have our Into the Fray. Again, I think this will be better, at least in the initial parts of the expansion, than it will be later, and then later we can go into Heavy Repercussions. The new one that they added in there actually is really interesting. It's called Instigate. Devastate now deals 20% increased damage and generates 2 rage, or Devastator, as we picked up here, now deals 10% increased damage and generates 1 rage. So this is why they nerfed the auto attack damage a little bit on Prot, because they're going to put in Strategist. So if they kept the auto attack damage where it was and then added an additional 10% to it, that actually ends up being quite a bit of auto attack damage, and auto attack damage is one of our largest sources of damage for Prot. So this actually is quite interesting. I don't know if it's going to be worth a talent point initially, because we definitely want to take our Rend because we are taking Blood and Thunder, and we definitely want the extra rage from Blood Surge because we have our bleeds from Rend and from our deep wounds. So I don't know if this is going to be worth it. It might be worth taking, but we'll have to do some testing and figure that out. So we have our Shield Wall. And then we have our Fueled by Violence. I think Fueled by Violence, because we are going more heavily into the bleeds, will probably net us a little bit more damage than it will in a scenario with Brutal Vitality in its place instead. I still would think we want to take Bolster, and I think we want to take Punish still, and I think all of these bad boys are too good at not to take. So we get down to the interesting part of the tree. So we obviously want to take our shield specialization, and I think you actually want to take every one of these because these are all so incredibly good. This is our 4-set bonus. Indomitable is so good, it speaks for itself how good it is. Booming Voice is a key piece to our thunder clapping, shockwaving god selves. And so let's spec this like we would for, say, an M+, where we're doing more AoE damage. The nice thing is they put the Focus Figure and Enduring Alacrity. These are all 1-pointers now. Like I said maybe a week or two ago, I'd really like if these were just 1-pointers, and that we could have a little bit more variety down here at the bottom, and we got our wish, which is pretty cool to see. So I think with our 4 points, I think we still want to take actually one of each of these because I think they're both very good. And so in a more of a Mythic Plus scenario, I think that we would do something like this with Storm of Steel. You could use the Dance of Death, and so it would have a little bit extra rage regeneration. I don't know if it's necessarily worth the extra bit of damage on your next Ravager, but the rage regeneration is a little bit better when we take Storm of Steel because it generates 15 rage each time it deals damage, up from 10, and 5 more rage every time it deals damage is not bad at all. So for a Mythic Plus environment, I would do something like this, but if we are going to more into a single target environment, I think Ravager gets less powerful, obviously, and I actually think Shield Charge is actually pretty decent now as they move the minimum requirement, which is very powerful. And then since we don't have to worry about hopping out of combat and charging back in with our Shield Charge, we can just use it in combat. Shield Charge now deals 20% increased damage, grants you shield block, revenge, and generates 30 additional rage. That's actually quite powerful, as we know how good Reprisal is now, even if Reprisal is a band-aid for an existing issue in live, which will go away with the new release of Dragonflight. So I actually think in a single target scenario, Shield Charge is actually pretty darn good. So it deals an additional 20% increased damage. So this deals the 20% increase there. So it's 275% of your attack bar. So it goes up to 295%, which is very, very nice. And even though you can't stun most bosses in an M+, this actually could be interesting. If it stuns a target for 4 seconds, this might be pretty funny in PvP, but I think this is what I would do for more of a single target build. And obviously if we're going a single target build, then we don't need the Shockwave talent, obviously. So I would take the Thunderous Roar here. We'll take our Enduring Alacrity and we'll get our Uproar. And then in a single target environment, you could also think about, instead of maybe going into Champion's Bulwark, you could put some extra damage into your bleeds up here if you wanted to do that. Or you could also take Instigate, as Instigate is a very high source, or auto attacks are a very high source of our damage. So that might actually be very good on single target. I don't know that Blood Surge is that valuable on single target. It might lose value just because you're only going to be proccing less rage because there's only one target to proc off of. So we might take that out and maybe make our bleeds do a little bit more damage. But I think for single target, I would probably do something like this instead. I still think Rend is very good on single target, even if it's not necessarily going to do as much damage, obviously, in an AoE situation, but I still think it is a very powerful talent. I really do like the side. And if you didn't want to go into the Thunderous Roar in a single target scenario, you could do something like this instead and take our Spear of Bastion. And I think I would probably keep everything else the same, all things considered. But for a single target environment, I think Spear is obviously a very fine choice. It will obviously do more damage than Shockwave will in a single target environment, but I think both Thunderous Roar or Spear of Bastion will be very good for a single target environment. It might be that Thunderous Roar making your bleeds do extra damage might net you more single target damage than Spear of Bastion, but it's hard to know. It'll be fight dependent, but going forward, I think it's worth looking at both of these. But I really actually like the changes in the Prot tree. I really like these guys being 1-point nodes now, so you can grab both of them and you don't feel bad about grabbing them. And thank God they removed the shield charge minimum range. This actually makes it somewhat viable now. I think it actually will be worth it in single target scenarios. Getting a free shield block, getting a free revenge and 30 rage every 45 seconds is quite powerful. That is quite a bit of extra bonuses that you get for clicking one button. So this actually got quite a bit more interesting. So this one increases the critical strike chance of it and the critical strike damage, and increases the auto attack speed by 20% for 20 seconds. that might be something that is worth looking into. I don't know. Again, for single target, this would primarily be for single target. I don't know if, for example, if this will net us more damage than Instigate will. I'm not positive. We would have to check and see, but it's very, very curious. This might be worth it on single target, but I'll have to do some testing and see what we can get. But for the most part, I'm really actually happy with the changes in the prod tree. They tuned some of the numbers, but I think a lot of the changes they made inside the tree are actually very, very powerful and very strong. And I'm really excited to test out the different builds. But again, don't sleep on the Shockwave build in M+, but I think that covers everything. So why don't we wrap up this video? All right, folks, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Warrior Updates. I appreciate all the love and support. I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope that I can continue to make these videos for you guys. And again, if you are interested in all things tanking, this is definitely the channel for you. But thank you one and all for watching. If you found this video useful, make sure to throw that subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment for the algorithm. That would be wonderful. Thank you all so much for your time and support. But I will catch you all in the next one. Remember to be safe and be kind, and I will see you all in the next one.